Baroness Araminta Thorne did not merely sneer, she laughed. The sound was deliberate, performative, a high-pitched peal of amusement that cut through the violins and the polite conversation like a slap across silk. Every head in the Pemberton ballroom turned. Elara Selwyn stood alone beneath the chandelier, her worn gloves clutching the wriggling body of a scruffy terrier. She felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes, the whispers spreading like fire across dry paper. Then the doors opened. Edward Northwood, Duke of Roxbury, entered the ballroom. His steel-gray eyes swept past the glittering baroness, past the smirking debutantes, and landed on the small dog trembling in Elara's arms. "That animal," he said, his voice slicing through the music like a knife through gauze, "bears the marker of the Selwyn Guardian. By the covenant of 1728, the dog and its keeper fall under the immediate protection of the Roxbury line." His gaze finally met Elara's. "Miss Selwyn is now under my personal jurisdiction." The orchestra stuttered to silence. But what does this ancient claim truly mean? Is Elara being saved from humiliation, or simply moved from one prison to a more elegant one? And why would the formidable Duke of Roxbury, a man who has spent 5 years hunting a legendary artifact, care so desperately about one unremarkable little dog? My sweet family, if you're enjoying this tale of hidden legacies and unexpected protection, subscribe so that I can bring you more stories of second chances. Let me know in the comments, Team Duke or Team Fennel, and tell me where you are watching from. The candles in the Pemberton ballroom had been lit to excess. Elara Selwyn stood at the edge of the parquet floor, positioned, she was certain deliberately, as far from the refreshment tables and the dancing as physically possible while still remaining technically in the ballroom. Her arms cradled Fennel, her father's terrier, whose mud-brown coat looked desperately out of place against the sea of silk and satin. She had begged to leave him in the carriage. The Baroness had refused. "You'll bring the creature," Araminta had said that evening, her smile sharp as cut crystal. "He's all you have left of dear Papa, isn't he? Surely you wouldn't abandon him in a cold carriage. What would people think?" What people thought, Elara now understood with sickening clarity, was exactly what the Baroness had intended them to think. Across the ballroom, Baroness Araminta Thorne held court near the orchestra dais, draped across a crimson settee like an empress surveying her domain. Her gown was Parisian, a deep emerald that made her look regal and dangerous. Her jewelry caught the candlelight, emeralds at her throat, gold combs woven through her elaborately dressed hair. Her stepdaughter, Cordelia, sat beside her in matching green, everything about them coordinated, polished, expensive. A calculated display of wealth, of legitimacy, of everything Elara was not. Elara looked down at her own gown, her mother's gown, really, altered twice. The ivory silk now gone ivory gray with age. The embroidery along the hem had been exquisite once. Now it looked tired, a relic from another era. The style was impossibly outdated. Too much ruching at the bodice, sleeves that puffed where they should be slim. And clutched against that faded gown, a scruffy terrier with burrs in his coat and one ear that refused to stand up properly. Fennel squirmed in her arms, his small body warm and solid and utterly oblivious to the social devastation he represented. Elara pressed her face briefly against his wiry fur, breathing in the familiar scent of him, earth and hay and home, the last remnants of her father's estate before Araminta had sold it piece by piece. "Good heavens," a woman's voice floated past, deliberately loud enough to carry. "Is that girl holding a dog?" "In a ballroom," another voice answered, scandalized delight dripping from every syllable. "I've never seen anything so vulgar." Elara's cheeks burned. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the precise geometric pattern of the parquet beneath her worn slippers. If she didn't look up, perhaps she could pretend this wasn't happening. Perhaps she could survive the next hour and escape to the carriage and never, ever appear in society again. Poor creature, a man murmured somewhere to her left. Elara wasn't certain if he meant her or Fennel. The Baroness's laugh cut through it all like breaking glass. Araminta had risen from her settee, one gloved hand pressed delicately to her bosom in a performance of maternal mortification. "I do apologize," she announced to the room at large, her voice pitched to carry to every corner. "My late husband's daughter is terribly devoted to that animal. I couldn't bear to separate them, even for an evening. One must make allowances for grief, mustn't one? Even when it manifests so eccentrically." The message was clear. Elara was mad with mourning, unbalanced, to be pitied and avoided in equal measure. Elara felt her world collapse into this single, humiliating moment. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred at the edges. Fennel whimpered softly, sensing her distress, and she held him tighter. Then the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. The change in the room was immediate, electric. Conversation died. The orchestra trailed into uncertain silence. Even the Baroness turned, her practiced expression of concern faltering. Edward Northwood, Duke of Roxbury, stepped into the ballroom. He was not a man who entered rooms so much as claimed them. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in severe black that made every other gentleman look foppish by comparison. His hair was dark, touched with premature silver at the temples. His face was all hard angles and aristocratic severity, the kind of face that appeared on ancient coins and family crests. But it was his eyes that made Elara's breath catch. Winter gray, sharp as flint, they swept across the ballroom with the precision of a man cataloging assets. They passed over the Baroness, over Cordelia, over Lord Pemberton and his glittering guests, and landed, with absolute focus, on the small terrier in Elara's arms. The Duke moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through water. People parted instinctively, pressing back against the walls. His boots struck the parquet with measured, inevitable rhythm. He stopped 3 paces from Elara. Up close, he was even more formidable. His eyes held hers for one brief, assessing moment, then dropped to Fennel. The terrier, for his part, cocked his lopsided ear and regarded the Duke with the cheerful incomprehension of a creature who had never met a person he didn't immediately trust. "May I?" the Duke asked. His voice was low, edged with something Elara couldn't identify. Not quite urgency. Something harder. Hunger, perhaps. Elara's hands tightened protectively around Fennel, but the Duke was already reaching forward. His movements were careful, surprisingly gentle for such large hands. He lifted Fennel's right ear, angling the dog's head toward the candlelight. Elara saw it then, what she had never noticed in 5 years of caring for her father's dog. A small mark beneath the ear, almost hidden in the wiry fur. It looked like a brand, ancient and deliberate, in the shape of a coiled serpent. The Duke's expression shifted. Something fierce and triumphant blazed across his features before he locked it away behind cold control. He released Fennel and straightened, turning to address the room at large. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of a man who had never been questioned. "That animal bears the marker of the Selwyn Guardian. By the covenant of 1728, the dog and its keeper fall under the immediate protection of the Roxbury line." The ballroom erupted in whispers. The Duke's gaze found Elara's once more. "Miss Selwyn is now under my personal jurisdiction." She and her companion will be removed to Roxbury Hall immediately." "Your Grace." The Baroness stepped forward, her face a mask of confusion that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Surely there's been some mistake. Elara is my ward, under my care. No longer." The Duke didn't even look at her. "The covenant supersedes all personal guardianship. Miss Selwyn, if you would come with me." It wasn't a request. The Duke's carriage was black lacquer and silver trim, pulled by 4 matched grays that looked as though they'd been carved from marble. Inside, the seats were upholstered in charcoal velvet so fine it felt like water beneath Elara's trembling hands. A single lamp swung gently from a brass hook, casting shifting shadows across the Duke's angular face. He sat across from her in perfect silence, his long legs taking up most of the available space, his attention fixed on some point beyond the window. Fennel had settled into Elara's lap with the easy contentment of a creature who believed all adventures ended well. Elara wished she shared his optimism. "Your Grace," she began, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "I don't understand." "You will." He didn't look at her. "Tomorrow. For now, rest." It was not a suggestion. The rest of the journey passed in suffocating quiet. Elara watched the London streets give way to countryside, the lights growing sparse and distant until there was nothing beyond the windows but darkness and the occasional silhouette of trees against the night sky. She had no idea where they were going. She had no idea if anyone knew where she'd gone. She had simply been claimed, like a piece of lost property, and removed. When the carriage finally stopped, Elara had dozed off against the velvet squabs, exhausted by fear and confusion. She woke to the Duke's voice, still cold, still distant. "We've arrived." Roxbury Hall rose against the pre-dawn sky like something out of a Gothic novel. It was massive, all gray stone and severe lines, with towers that scraped the clouds and windows that reflected nothing but darkness. No warm light spilled from those windows, no smoke rose cheerfully from the chimneys. The house looked like a fortress, designed to keep the world out rather than welcome anyone in, or perhaps, Elara thought with a chill, designed to keep someone in. A servant appeared, an elderly man in impeccable livery who somehow managed to look both deferential and deeply disapproving. "Your Grace." "Henderson, show Miss Selwyn to the Rose Suite. See that she has everything she requires." The Duke's boots struck the gravel drive with sharp, dismissive clicks. He was already walking away toward the house, his attention already elsewhere. "Your Grace," Elara called after him, clutching Fennel against her chest. "Please, I need to understand what's happening." "Why did you—" He stopped, turned. In the gray light of approaching dawn, his face looked carved from the same stone as his house. "You are here because that dog is essential to a matter of critical importance to my family. You will be housed, fed, and protected. In exchange, you will make yourself available to assist in my research. Those are the terms of your residence here, Miss Selwyn. I suggest you reconcile yourself to them." "But I don't. I didn't agree to." "Your agreement is immaterial. The covenant is law. Henderson will explain the household routine in the morning. Good night." He disappeared into the dark maw of the entrance hall. Elara stood in the gravel drive, her worn slippers soaking through with dew, and felt the last fragile hope drain out of her. She had not been rescued. She had simply been transferred from one cage to another, this one larger and colder and infinitely more isolating. Henderson cleared his throat delicately. "Miss Selwyn, if you would follow me." The Rose Suite was not rose-colored. It was decorated in shades of cream and pale blue, beautiful in an austere, impersonal way, like a room in an expensive hotel. The furniture was elegant but sparse. A four-poster bed with embroidered hangings, a writing desk positioned beneath a tall window, a wardrobe that could have held the entire contents of Elara's former life 3 times over. A fire had been laid in the grate, and someone had left a tray on the bedside table. Tea in a silver pot, bread and cold chicken, a small bowl of water clearly intended for Fennel. Thoughtful, efficient, utterly devoid of warmth. Elara set Fennel down. He immediately began exploring, his nails clicking against the polished floor, utterly delighted with this new adventure. She envied him his simple joy. She did not sleep. She sat in the window seat as the sun rose, watching the grounds of Roxbury Hall emerge from darkness. Vast manicured lawns, geometric gardens. In the distance, a lake that reflected the sky like polished silver. It was beautiful the way a painting was beautiful, perfect, untouchable, cold. When Henderson knocked at 8 o'clock precisely, Elara had already dressed in the same gray gown from the ball. She had nothing else. "His Grace requests your presence in the library, Miss Selwyn." The library was a cathedral of books. 3 stories tall, lined floor to ceiling with volumes bound in leather, their spines stamped with gold. Ladders on rails provided access to the higher shelves. Long tables dominated the center of the room, their surfaces covered with open books, loose papers, maps weighted down with paperweights shaped like ravens. The Duke stood at one of these tables, still dressed in black, his attention fixed on a document so old the edges had gone brown and brittle. He didn't look up when Elara entered. "Miss Selwyn, bring the dog here, please." Elara bristled at the tone, command, not request, but complied. Fennel trotted beside her cheerfully, his tail wagging. The Duke finally looked at her, though his gaze went immediately to Fennel. The mark beneath his ear is called the Selwyn Cipher. It has been passed down through a specific breeding line for 300 years. The last documented guardian dog died in 1802. Your father, I believe, acquired this animal 5 years ago? "Yes," Elara said quietly. "From a farmer in Cornwall. The man was going to drown the litter. Papa couldn't bear it." "Your father was James Selwyn, 3rd son of the Baron Selwyn of Ashford Cross?" "Yes." "Then he knew exactly what he was acquiring." The Duke's voice was sharp, certain. "The Selwyn line has been tied to my family for centuries. They were guardians of a document, the Roxbury Cipher, which was stolen in 1728. The charter I invoked last night was signed in blood by both our ancestors. The Selwyns swore to protect the cipher. The Roxburys swore to protect the Selwyns in turn." Elara stared at him. "My father never mentioned any of this." "Perhaps he intended to. Perhaps he died before he could." The Duke's expression was unreadable. "Regardless, the covenant stands. The mark on this dog suggests he knows, instinctively, through bloodline, where the cipher is hidden. I have spent 5 years searching. You, Miss Selwyn, are going to help me find it. I don't know anything about a cipher. You will learn." He gestured to the table, to the mountains of research. "You can read, I presume?" "Of course I can read." "Then you'll begin here. These are the Selwyn family histories, cross-referenced with Roxbury estate records. I need you to review them for any mention of hiding places, codes, or references to guardian animals. You'll work mornings in the library. Afternoons, you'll walk the grounds with the dog. I want to see where he goes, what draws his attention." Elara felt anger kindle in her chest, bright and unfamiliar. "You want me to spy on my own dog? I want you to fulfill the purpose for which you were brought here." The Duke's voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "You are not a guest, Miss Selwyn. You are a necessary component of this research. I suggest you reconcile yourself to that reality. And if I refuse?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something flicker in those winter-gray eyes. Not cruelty, exactly. Something colder. Certainty. "You won't," he said simply. "You have nowhere else to go." The Baroness made that abundantly clear. "Here, you have shelter, safety, purpose. I am offering you more than you had yesterday." It was true. Horribly, undeniably true. "Now," the Duke continued, turning back to his documents, "begin with the volume on the left. Take notes. Report anything relevant directly to me." Elara stood frozen. Fennel pressed against her ankles and understood with crystalline clarity what she had become. A prisoner of privilege. Trapped in luxury. Still utterly powerless. Still under the absolute control of someone who saw her not as a person, but as a means to an end. The cage had changed. The bars were still there, gilded and beautiful and completely unyielding. The volume the Duke indicated was bound in cracked leather, the color of dried blood. When Elara lifted the cover, the spine creaked in protest, and the smell of old parchment and mildew rose like a ghost. "Carefully," the Duke said, not looking up from his own work. "That manuscript is dated 1697. Elara's hands trembled slightly as she turned the first brittle page. The text was handwritten in elaborate script. The ink faded to brown. Margin notes crowded the edges in what appeared to be 3 different hands, spanning generations. At the top of the page, an illustration had been rendered in painstaking detail. A small terrier, rough-coated and alert, with something marked clearly beneath its upright ear. The same coiled serpent she'd seen on Fennel. She read slowly, struggling with the archaic language and the florid style. The text described a breeding program established in 1672 by Lord Marcus Roxbury and his most trusted companion, Sir Edmund Selwyn. The dogs were to be guardians in truth and symbol, each bearing the mark as proof of their sacred duty. What were they guarding? Elara asked. The Duke's pen paused in its scratching across his own notes. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he set the pen down with deliberate care and crossed to where she sat. "Move," he said. Elara shifted to the adjacent chair. The Duke took her place, pulling the ancient volume toward him. His fingers, long, elegant, surprisingly gentle with the fragile pages, flipped forward through the manuscript until he found what he sought. There. He turned the book so she could see. The page showed a document rendered in miniature, precise enough that Elara could make out individual words. At the top, in letters illuminated with gold leaf that had somehow survived 3 centuries, the Roxbury Cipher. "In 1672, the Duke began, his voice taking on the cadence of a story told many times, rehearsed until every word carried weight. My ancestor, Lord Marcus Roxbury, was accused of treason. The specifics hardly matter now. A Catholic plot, a forged letter, political maneuvering during a dangerous time. He was arrested, his land seized, his name destroyed." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Marcus's younger brother, Thomas, who inherited the title and estates after Marcus was executed, spent his entire life trying to prove his brother's innocence. He claimed Marcus had prepared a document, a cipher, that contained proof of his loyalty, names of the true conspirators, correspondence from the king himself. But Thomas could never find it. Neither could his son, or his grandson, or any Roxbury since. Until the document became a legend, Elara said quietly. Until it became a shame. The Duke's voice was flat, emotionless, but Elara heard the tension beneath it like a wire pulled taut. Every Duke of Roxbury for 300 years has inherited not just the title and the estates, but the knowledge that our line was founded on cowardice. Thomas accepted the title and the fortune built on his brother's execution. He lived in luxury, while Marcus's name remained blackened, his children disinherited, his memory erased. The Duke turned to look at her directly, and Elara saw something raw in his winter-gray eyes, quickly shuddered. The Roxbury name is built on a lie. Every alliance, every marriage, every advantage we've enjoyed for 3 centuries is tainted by the fact that we have never, not once, proven Marcus's innocence. We accepted our good fortune and let an innocent man's legacy rot. But the Selwyns. Sir Edmund Selwyn was Marcus's closest friend. According to family records, Edmund swore on his life that Marcus was loyal, that the proof existed. He was stripped of his own title for defending a traitor, reduced to a minor country squire. But he never recanted. The Selwyn family maintained, generation after generation, that they were guardians of the truth. The Duke pulled another volume from the stack, this one smaller, the binding more recent. He opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. This is a letter from Edmund Selwyn to Thomas Roxbury, dated 1674. Read it. Elara leaned forward. The handwriting was different from the manuscript, but still archaic, difficult. She read aloud, haltingly, "My Lord Duke, though you have chosen the path of silence and prosperity, I remain bound by the oath I swore to your brother. The truth is preserved. The mark endures. When the time comes, when a Roxbury with courage enough to face the past emerges, the Guardian line will reveal what has been hidden. Until then, I remain, in faith and sorrow, Edmund Selwyn." Silence filled the library like water rising. "The mark endures," the Duke repeated softly. "For 200 years, we thought it was metaphorical. Then in 1802, a Selwyn daughter married into another family and took her guardian dog with her. The line was lost, or so we believed." He reached down and lifted Fennel onto the table with surprising gentleness. The terrier's tail wagged, delighted with this new attention. The Duke carefully folded back Fennel's ear, revealing the small brand beneath. "Your father acquired this dog 5 years ago, not randomly, not out of simple kindness." The Duke's voice was certain, absolute. James Selwyn was a 3rd son with no inheritance, no prospects, living quietly in the country, but he was still a Selwyn. He knew what this mark meant. "He never said anything," Elara whispered. "Not once. He just called Fennel his lucky charm. Perhaps he was waiting for the right time. Perhaps he was protecting you from knowledge that had destroyed his own ancestors." The Duke released Fennel, who immediately began investigating the papers on the table. But he kept the line alive. He preserved the Guardian, and now that Guardian has led me to you. Elara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You think I know where the cipher is hidden. I think your father left you the final piece of a puzzle, 300 years in the making." The Duke returned to his own chair, his expression settling back into its usual severe control. "Whether you know it consciously or not. And if I don't? If my father simply rescued a dog, and there's nothing more to it?" The Duke's eyes met hers, and in them she saw the weight of 3 centuries of shame, of inherited guilt, of a family name built on compromise and silence. "Then I will have failed, as every Roxbury before me has failed, to restore the honor of an innocent man executed for crimes he did not commit. His voice was quiet, but it carried the force of absolute conviction. I will not let Marcus Roxbury remain a footnote of treason in history books. I will not continue to prosper from his death, while his name rots in infamy. The cipher exists, Miss Selwyn. Your father knew it. That dog proves it. You're asking me to solve a mystery that has defeated your entire family for 300 years. I'm not asking. The Duke's expression didn't change. The covenant binds you to this task, just as surely as it binds me. You are the last Selwyn Guardian. I am the current Duke of Roxbury. We have roles to play in this, whether we chose them or not. Elara looked down at Fennel, who had settled contentedly beside the ancient manuscript, utterly oblivious to the weight of history being placed on his scruffy shoulders. Her father had called him a lucky charm. Had he known? Had he understood what he was preserving? Or had he simply saved a litter of puppies from drowning and died before he could explain that this particular small terrier, carried the blood of centuries and the hope of redemption? I'll help you, Elara said finally, because what choice did she have? But I need you to understand. I don't know anything about ciphers or conspiracies or guardian dogs. My father was a quiet man who liked his books and his garden. If he left me some grand secret, he hid it well. Then we'll find it together. The Duke pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him. Begin with your father's habits. His library, his correspondence, places he traveled, people he visited. Everything, no matter how insignificant it seems. Elara drew the ancient manuscript back toward her, studying the illustration of the guardian dog with its coiled serpent mark. 300 years of loyalty, 300 years of shame. And somehow, impossibly, she and her scruffy terrier were supposed to end it. She picked up a pen and began to write. 3 days into her captivity, for Elara had stopped pretending it was anything else, she had read more about the Roxbury family than she had ever wished to know. Estate records, marriage settlements, household inventories dating back to the Restoration. The Duke's research was exhaustive, meticulous, and utterly overwhelming. And completely, she was beginning to suspect, misdirected. She sat at her assigned table in the library, Fennel dozing at her feet, while the Duke worked across the room with 2 other men. He'd introduced them briefly on the second day. Mr. Bartholomew Finch, a pinch-faced antiquarian who looked at Elara as though she were a stain on the carpet, and Dr. William Ashford, a historian from Cambridge whose spectacles were held together with wire and optimism. They were currently debating, with increasing frustration, a reference in a 1689 letter from Thomas Roxbury to his solicitor. The matter rests in the keeping of the faithful, as Edmund assured me before his passing, Dr. Ashford read for the 3rd time. It must refer to a church. Edmund Selwyn was buried at St. Michael's in Ashford Cross. The cipher could be hidden in his tomb. We excavated that tomb 2 years ago, the Duke said, his voice tight with barely controlled impatience. There was nothing. Perhaps we missed something, a false bottom in the coffin, or... We X-rayed the coffin, Ashford. There was nothing. Mr. Finch cleared his throat delicately. The faithful could refer to faithful servants, the Selwyn household staff. Perhaps one of them was entrusted. We've traced every servant in the Selwyn household records for 3 generations, the Duke interrupted. None of them left anything suspicious in their own wills or effects. Elara listened to them argue in circles, the same ground they'd apparently covered dozens of times before. She turned back to her own assignment, reading through her father's personal correspondence, which the Duke had somehow obtained from the Baroness. Most of it was crushingly mundane. Letters to his tailor, notes about crop rotation, a long, enthusiastic exchange with a botanist in Edinburgh about a particular variety of climbing rose. She picked up another letter, this one to a bookseller in London, and paused. Her father had written, "I seek any volumes relating to canine husbandry, particularly breeding records of working terriers in Cornwall and Devon. Of special interest are any references to the old Guardian lines, though I suspect such information is more often kept in family Bibles than formal stud books." Family Bibles. Elara set the letter down carefully and looked across the room to where the Duke was now pacing, his frustration evident in the sharp clicks of his boots against the polished floor. "Your Grace," she said. The three men didn't hear her. Mr. Finch was now suggesting they search Edmund Selwyn's country chapel again, perhaps examining the stained glass for coded messages. "Your Grace," Elara repeated, louder this time. The Duke stopped mid-stride and turned, his expression suggesting he'd forgotten she was there. "Yes, Miss Selwyn?" "The faithful," she said, standing and crossing to their table. "You're assuming it means people." Dr. Ashford blinked at her from behind his wire spectacles. What else could it possibly mean? "My father kept a Bible," Elara said quietly. "He called it his faithful companion. He read from it every night before bed, not because he was particularly devout, but because his father had done the same and his father before him. He said the margins held more wisdom than the verses." The Duke's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting the Selwyn family Bible." Elara gestured to the letter she'd been reading. "My father was researching guardian dog lineages just before he acquired Fennel. He mentioned that such information was kept in family Bibles. What if Edmund Selwyn kept more than genealogies in his?" Mr. Finch made a dismissive sound. "The Selwyn Bible was catalogued among the family effects in 1812, after the main line died out. It's simply a record of births, marriages, and deaths. Nothing more." "Have you examined it personally?" Elara asked. "Well, no. But the catalog description is quite clear." "Where is it now?" The Duke interrupted, his attention suddenly sharp, focused entirely on Elara. Dr. Ashford shuffled through papers. "According to the records, it was sold at auction in 1815, along with the last of the Selwyn estate. Purchased by..." He ran his finger down the page. "A Mr. Thomas Hartwell of Somerset." "Find it." The Duke's voice cut like a blade. "Send inquiries to Somerset immediately. I want that Bible located within the week." "Your Grace," Mr. Finch said, his tone patronizing. "I hardly think a spurious suggestion from a young woman with no academic training should derail months of serious research." The Duke turned to him, and Elara saw something cold flash in those winter-gray eyes. "That spurious suggestion, Finch, is the first new avenue of inquiry we've had in 18 months. You and Ashford will travel to Somerset tomorrow. You will find the Hartwell family, and you will acquire that Bible by whatever means necessary. Am I clear?" Mr. Finch's face flushed red, but he nodded stiffly. The Duke turned back to Elara. For a long moment, he simply studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, "Your father's Bible, the one he read from. Do you still have it?" "The Baroness sold most of his effects," Elara said quietly. "But his Bible was in my room at her house. She considered it worthless, old, damaged, the binding falling apart. I brought it with me when we left for the ball. It's in my trunk." The Duke moved past her without another word, striding toward the library door. "Henderson!" The elderly butler appeared within seconds, as though he'd been waiting in the corridor. "Miss Selwyn's trunk. Bring it to the library immediately." "At once, Your Grace." The next 10 minutes passed in tense silence. Mr. Finch and Dr. Ashford exchanged glances, but said nothing. Elara stood awkwardly beside the table, uncertain whether she'd done something brilliant or monumentally foolish. When Henderson returned, carrying her small, battered trunk as though it contained precious jewels, the Duke took it from him personally. He set it on the table and looked at Elara. "May I?" It was the first time he'd asked her permission for anything. Elara nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. The Duke opened the trunk. Her meager possessions looked even more pathetic here in this grand library. 2 faded dresses, a pair of worn slippers, her mother's hairbrush with half the bristles missing. And beneath them, wrapped in a cloth, her father's Bible. The Duke lifted it with careful hands. The binding was indeed falling apart, the leather cracked and dried, the pages loose in their stitching. He carried it to the table and set it down beneath the lamp. When he opened it, loose papers fluttered out. Old letters, pressed flowers, a ribbon that might have been a christening favor. And on the inside cover, in faded brown ink, the Selwyn family tree stretched back to the 17th century. The Duke's finger traced down the names. Edmund Selwyn, his son Richard, the line continuing through younger sons and daughters, diminishing with each generation, until it reached James Selwyn, and below James's name, in her father's careful handwriting, Elara Selwyn, born 1801. "He listed you," the Duke said quietly, "even though you're a daughter, even though the male line had ended." "He said I was a Selwyn regardless of convention," Elara whispered. "That blood mattered more than law." The Duke turned the page carefully. The Bible itself began, Genesis in cramped text. But the margins were crowded with notes in multiple hands, spanning generations. "Here," Dr. Ashford breathed, leaning over the Duke's shoulder. "This note beside Psalm 23. The Guardian rests in green pastures still. E.S. 1674. "Edmund Selwyn," the Duke said. His hands were perfectly steady, but Elara heard the tension in his voice. "He wrote this 2 years after Marcus's execution." "Green pastures," Mr. Finch murmured. "A graveyard?" "No." Elara heard her own voice, surprised by its certainty. She moved closer, studying the note. "My father kept sheep. He always called the south pasture his green sanctuary. He said his grandfather had called it that, and his grandfather before him." The Duke looked up at her. "The Selwyn estate, where your father lived?" "The Baroness sold it 6 months ago, to a Mr. Winters from Manchester. He was planning to drain the south pasture for development." The Duke was already moving, gathering papers, issuing orders. "Henderson, have my horse readied. Ashford, find the deed records for the Selwyn property. I want to know the exact boundaries of that south pasture. Finch, send word to this Mr. Winters that I'm prepared to pay whatever price he asks for the land." He stopped, turned back to Elara. For the first time since she'd met him, something almost like a smile ghosted across his severe features. "You saw what we missed, Miss Selwyn. Your father's eccentric habits, his love of sheep and flowers and marginal notes." The Duke's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made her breath catch. "You may have just ended 300 years of searching." The following afternoon, while the Duke's men traveled to Somerset and made arrangements regarding her father's former estate, Elara found herself trapped in the Rose Suite with an increasingly restless terrier. Fennel had been patient for 3 days, content to doze under library tables and explore the limited confines of her rooms. But patience, Elara was discovering, was not an infinite resource for a young dog accustomed to country freedom. He paced the elegant carpet, whined at the window, and finally brought her his lead, a frayed leather thing she'd tucked into her trunk, and dropped it meaningfully at her feet. "I know," Elara murmured, reaching down to scratch his ears. "But I'm not certain I'm allowed to simply wander the grounds." Fennel whined again. More insistently, she was saved from deciding by a knock at her door. Henderson stood in the corridor, his expression as carefully neutral as ever. "Miss Selwyn, His Grace requests that you exercise the dog. He will accompany you." Requests. The word was pure fiction, but Elara had learned to recognize the Duke's commands when she heard them, however politely Henderson translated them. She found the Duke waiting at the base of the main staircase, dressed not in his usual severe black, but in riding clothes. Buff breeches, tall boots, a coat of dark green superfine. He looked less like a duke and more like a country gentleman, though the effect was somewhat undermined by the stack of papers he carried under one arm. "Miss Selwyn," he acknowledged, his eyes dropping immediately to Fennel. "The dog requires exercise, I presume?" "Yes, Your Grace. He's accustomed to more freedom than I've been able to provide here." Something flickered across the Duke's face. Was it guilt? But it vanished before Elara could identify it with certainty. "Come." He led her through a side door and out into the grounds of Roxbury Hall. The formal gardens gave way to parkland, vast stretches of manicured grass dotted with ancient oaks. In the distance, the lake she'd seen from her window glittered in the afternoon sun. Fennel, released from his lead, immediately began racing in ecstatic circles, his small body a blur of motion and joy. The Duke watched him with an expression Elara couldn't quite read. "He's happy here." "He's happy anywhere he can run," Elara said quietly. "He doesn't understand estates or titles or ancient covenants. He simply exists, moment to moment, finding joy where he can." "A skill I envy," the Duke murmured, so softly Elara almost missed it. They walked in silence for a time, following a gravel path that wound through the parkland. The Duke still carried his papers, though he made no move to consult them. Fennel darted ahead, investigating interesting smells and chasing insects with equal enthusiasm. "Your father's south pasture," the Duke said abruptly. "Mr. Winters has agreed to sell. We take possession in 3 days. I've arranged for a team to begin excavation immediately." "You work quickly, Your Grace." "I've waited long enough." His voice was flat, controlled, but Elara heard the tension beneath it. Every Roxbury Duke for 300 years has inherited this burden. Most of them abandoned the search within a few years, content to live with the shame as long as the wealth remained intact. I will not be another name in that list of failures. Elara glanced at him. In the afternoon light, away from the oppressive shadows of the library, he looked younger somehow. She realized with a start that he couldn't be more than 30, though he carried himself with the gravity of a much older man. "Why?" she asked. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but you have everything already. Title, wealth, influence. Why does a 300-year-old shame matter so much?" The Duke stopped walking. For a long moment, he stared across the parkland toward the lake, his profile carved in sharp relief against the sky. When he spoke, his voice was carefully measured, as though each word had been weighed and found barely acceptable. "When I was 8 years old, my father took me to London for the opening of Parliament. We attended a reception at Carlton House. I was excited. It was my first real introduction to society, my first opportunity to understand what it meant to be a Roxbury." He paused, his jaw tightening. A group of older boys, sons of other peers, cornered me in one of the corridors. They asked me if I knew what my family was. I said I was a duke's son. They laughed. One of them, Lord Ashford's grandson, ironically, told me that everyone knew the Roxburys were traitor-made dukes, that we'd built our fortune on the corpse of an innocent man, that my ancestor had watched his own brother hang rather than risk his inheritance. Elara's chest constricted. You were a child. I was a Roxbury. The shame is inherited along with the title. The Duke's voice remained level, emotionless, but his hands had clenched around the papers he carried. I went to my father that night and asked if it was true. He told me yes. He told me every duke before him had tried to find proof of Marcus's innocence and failed. He said the kindest thing to do was to accept it, to live well, and to stop chasing ghosts. But you didn't. I couldn't. For the first time, real emotion cracked through the Duke's controlled facade. I've spent my entire life being introduced as the Duke of Roxbury, watching people's faces when they place the name. The slight pause, the careful neutrality, the knowledge that behind every alliance, every friendship, every business arrangement, there's a whisper. Traitor-made. He turned to look at her directly, and Elara saw something raw in his winter-gray eyes. I don't want the cipher for glory, Miss Selwyn. I don't want it for historical curiosity or academic recognition. I want it because I am tired of carrying a shame I did not earn for a crime that was never committed. I want to stand in Parliament and know that when men look at me, they see a Roxbury who restored his family's honor, not another duke content to prosper from murder. The words hung between them, more honest than anything he'd shared before. Fennel chose that moment to race back, a stick clutched triumphantly in his jaws, utterly delighted with his discovery. He dropped it at the Duke's feet and wagged his entire body in anticipation. The Duke stared down at the stick, then at Fennel's hopeful face, clearly at a loss. He wants you to throw it, Elara said softly. I've never... The Duke gestured helplessly at the stick. Pick it up. Throw it. He'll bring it back. The Duke bent stiffly, as though performing an alien ritual, and picked up the stick with 2 fingers. He threw it, an awkward, overly formal toss that sent it perhaps 10 feet. Fennel exploded after it anyway, thrilled beyond measure. He doesn't care that you're a duke, Elara observed. He doesn't care about your family's history or your shame or your search for redemption. He simply wants you to throw a stick. The Duke watched Fennel return, the stick held high like a trophy. I don't know how to be that simple. I don't think you were ever allowed to be. Fennel dropped the stick again, his tail a blur of motion. The Duke picked it up again, and this time his throw was less formal, traveling farther. Something almost like satisfaction crossed his face when Fennel raced after it. My father told me that duty was everything, the Duke said quietly. That personal happiness was a luxury for men without titles. That every decision I made should be weighed against the good of the Roxbury name. He sounds like he was lonely. He was dutiful. The Duke's voice was firm, but Elara heard the question beneath it. The uncertainty. Fennel returned for a 3rd time, and this time the Duke threw the stick without prompting, his movement more natural. They stood together in the afternoon sun, watching the small terrier race across the perfect grass. And for the first time since Elara had arrived at Roxbury Hall, the Duke looked like something other than a man obsessed. He looked tired, and young, and terribly, desperately alone. Your Grace, Elara said carefully, what will you do if we find the cipher and it doesn't contain what you hope? The Duke's hand stilled halfway to retrieving the stick Fennel had just dropped. What do you mean? What if Marcus Roxbury was guilty? What if the cipher proves his treason rather than his innocence? The silence that followed was profound. The Duke straightened slowly, his expression closing off, the brief moment of vulnerability vanishing behind his usual severe control. "Then I will have my answer," he said finally, "and the search will end. Either way, I will know the truth." But Elara saw the fear in his eyes, carefully hidden but undeniably there. He wasn't afraid of failure. He was afraid of success, of finally finding the document that had consumed his entire life and discovering it destroyed rather than restored his family's honor. He was afraid that his father had been right, that chasing ghosts was futile and duty demanded accepting shame with grace. Fennel whined softly, nudging the stick toward the Duke's boot. The Duke picked it up and threw it one more time, his movements mechanical now, his attention already retreating back into the fortress of obsession and control. But Elara had seen the crack in the facade, and she understood with sudden clarity that the treasure the Duke truly needed was not a piece of 300-year-old parchment. It was permission to be something other than the sum of his inherited duty. The Baroness arrived on the 5th morning of Elara's residence at Roxbury Hall, her carriage a gleaming monstrosity of burgundy lacquer and gold trim that looked entirely out of place against the austere gray stone of the Duke's estate. Elara was in the library when Henderson appeared, his usual composure slightly ruffled. "Miss Selwyn, I thought you should be informed. Baroness Thorne has arrived and is demanding an audience with His Grace. She is quite insistent." Elara's hands went cold. She set down the genealogical record she'd been studying. "Did she say why she's come?" "She claims parental concern for your welfare, miss, and—" Henderson hesitated, which was so uncharacteristic that Elara's stomach dropped. "She has mentioned certain property she believes you removed from her household without permission." "I took nothing but my own belongings." "I'm certain that's true, miss. His Grace is receiving her now in the red drawing room. He asked that you remain here." Which meant, Elara understood, that she was to stay hidden while the Duke dealt with Araminta. The idea should have brought relief. Instead, it kindled something sharp and hot in her chest, anger at being managed, at having decisions made about her without her input, even when those decisions were meant to protect her. She had traded the Baroness's cage for the Duke's. The bars were more comfortable, but they were still bars. "I'll remain here," she said quietly, though every instinct screamed to do otherwise. Henderson withdrew. Elara tried to return to her reading, but the words swam meaninglessly before her eyes. Fennel, sensing her distress, pressed against her ankles and whined softly. She lasted perhaps 10 minutes before her resolve crumbled. She was not a child to be sequestered away while adults discussed her fate. She was a Selwyn, the last Selwyn Guardian, according to the Duke's own research. If Araminta had come to Roxbury Hall, Elara had a right to know why. She left Fennel in the library and made her way through the corridors, following the sound of raised voices. The red drawing room was in the east wing. A formal receiving room, the Duke apparently reserved for visitors he wished to intimidate. Elara had been shown it once during Henderson's initial tour, all crimson silk and dark portraits of disapproving ancestors. She stopped outside the closed door, her heart hammering. "Absolute right to see her, Your Grace. I am her legal guardian, appointed by her late father's will. Whatever fantasy you've concocted about ancient covenants and guardian dogs, the law is quite clear." The Baroness's voice was sharp, imperious, the tone of a woman accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of will. The Duke's response was cold as winter frost. The Covenant of 1728 predates any will your husband may have written. It was ratified by Parliament and signed into law. Miss Selwyn's guardianship falls to the Roxbury line when a guardian animal is identified. I've had my solicitors confirm every detail. Solicitors can be persuaded to interpret documents creatively, Your Grace, especially when the client is a duke with unlimited resources. A pause. Then Araminta's voice turned silken, dangerous. But I'm not here to argue legal niceties. I'm here as a concerned stepmother, worried for a young woman who may have been misled about certain family matters. Explain. Elara pressed closer to the door, her breath shallow. James Selwyn was a charming man, but an impractical one, the Baroness said. He filled his daughter's head with ridiculous stories about ancient bloodlines and sacred duties. But he also left debts, Your Grace. Considerable debts. Before his death, he sold several family heirlooms to a private collector, items that should have passed to Elara as part of her mother's legacy. I fail to see how this concerns me. One of those items was a jeweled collar, 18th century, quite valuable. The buyer later discovered it was paste, a clever forgery. He's threatening legal action. I have reason to believe James hid the genuine article somewhere among Elara's possessions. Perhaps in that ratty trunk of hers, and she removed it when you so gallantly spirited her away from the Pemberton ball. The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. Elara's father had owned no jeweled collars, had sold no heirlooms. He died with barely enough to cover the funeral costs. You're suggesting Miss Selwyn is a thief. The Duke's voice had gone dangerously quiet. I'm suggesting she may not realize what she has. I'd like to examine her belongings, purely to resolve this matter and protect her from accusations of theft. Surely you wouldn't deny a stepmother the chance to protect her ward's reputation. Elara's mind raced. The Baroness had never cared about her reputation. This was something else, a fishing expedition disguised as maternal concern. But what was Araminta really searching for? The answer struck her with sudden clarity. The Baroness had been married to James Selwyn for 3 years before his death. She'd had access to his library, his papers, his conversations. What if she'd learned something about the cipher? What if she suspected Elara had inherited more than just a scruffy terrier? You will not examine Miss Selwyn's belongings, the Duke said, each word precisely enunciated. You will not question her, correspond with her, or attempt any contact whatsoever. The covenant is clear, Baroness. She is under my protection now, which means she is beyond your reach. This is absurd. I have rights. You have nothing. The Duke's voice cut through her protest like a blade. Whatever authority you held over Miss Selwyn ended the moment I invoked the covenant. If you believe she possesses stolen property, you may take your complaint to the magistrate. Otherwise, I suggest you return to London before I have you removed from my property. A long, tense silence followed. When the Baroness spoke again, her voice had changed, still controlled, but with an edge of something darker beneath. You're making a mistake, Your Grace. James Selwyn was not the devoted father Elara believes him to be. He was a desperate man who made dangerous bargains. Whatever you think that dog will lead you to, I promise you the truth is far more complicated than ancient family honor. Is that a threat, madam? It's a warning. From someone who knows more about the Selwyn family secrets than you might imagine. Araminta's footsteps clicked across the floor, moving toward the door. When you discover I'm right, and you will, remember that I offered to help. Elara barely had time to press herself into the alcove beside the door before it opened. The Baroness swept out in a cloud of expensive perfume and barely controlled rage, her face a mask of aristocratic disdain. She didn't notice Elara in the shadows. simply continued down the corridor with Cordelia trailing silently behind her. Elara waited until she heard the front door close, until Henderson's footsteps faded away, before she stepped into the open doorway of the red drawing room. The Duke stood with his back to the door, one hand braced against the mantelpiece, his head bowed. For a moment, he looked utterly exhausted. "You heard?" It wasn't a question. "Yes." He turned to face her. "I told you to remain in the library." "I know." Elara lifted her chin. "But this concerns me, Your Grace. My father, my possessions, my reputation. I'm not a child to be hidden away while others decide my fate." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest hint of approval. "Your stepmother is a formidable opponent." "She's a liar." Elara's voice was steady despite the anger thrumming through her. "My father owned no jeweled collars. He sold nothing to collectors. She invented that story." "I know." The Duke moved away from the mantelpiece, his usual control reasserting itself. "The question is why? What does she believe you have?" "The same thing you're searching for." Elara met his gaze directly. "She knows about the cipher, or suspects at least. She had 3 years to observe my father, to ask questions, to piece together hints. What if she learned enough to understand its value?" The Duke's expression darkened. "Then she's more dangerous than I anticipated. If she believes the cipher exists and suspects you hold the key to finding it, she won't stop at a single visit." "What will you do?" "Exactly what I told her. Keep you beyond her reach." He studied Elara for a long moment. "Did your father ever mention your stepmother in connection with his research? Any conversations about family history? About the Guardian line?" Elara thought back, searching her memories of those final months before her father's death. "He became more secretive after he married her. He used to share his research with me, his theories about ancient bloodlines and breeding records. After Araminta arrived, he kept his library door locked. He told me." She paused, thus memory surfacing with painful clarity. "He told me that some secrets were too valuable to share, even with family, especially with family. He didn't trust her. No, and neither should we." Elara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire crackling in the hearth. "Your Grace, what if the Baroness tries to claim Fennel? If she believes the dog is essential to finding the cipher, she won't get near him." The Duke's voice was absolute, a promise carved in steel. "Or you. Whatever game your stepmother is playing, she'll play it alone. You have my word, Miss Selwyn. No one will touch you or that dog while you remain under my protection." The certainty in his voice should have comforted her. Instead, it reminded Elara of the central truth of her situation. She was protected, yes, but still possessed. A necessary piece in the Duke's grand quest, valuable only for what she might help him find. The Baroness couldn't reach her, but she also couldn't leave. The discovery came 3 days after the Baroness's visit, while Elara was searching through the remaining items from her trunk for the 4th time at the Duke's request. He'd become increasingly focused, almost feverish, in his preparations for the excavation of her father's south pasture. Every scrap of paper, every personal effect that had belonged to James Selwyn was being examined with microscopic attention. The Duke had even brought in a specialist from Oxford, a dour woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who claimed to be an expert in deciphering coded correspondence. Elara had turned out her trunk completely, spreading its meager contents across the table in her room. The 2 faded dresses, her mother's hairbrush, a small wooden box that contained her mother's wedding ring and a lock of her baby hair, her father's Bible, now in the Duke's possession, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials. A. She stopped. At the very bottom of the trunk, tucked into the corner where the lining had come loose, was something she'd never noticed before. With trembling fingers, Elara worked the object free. It was paper, folded small and wedged so tightly into the gap that it had become part of the trunk's structure. The edges were charred, blackened as though someone had tried to burn it and then thought better of it. Her father's handwriting covered what remained of the page. Elara carried it to the window, her heart hammering. The sunlight revealed how damaged the letter was. Whole sections burned away, the ink faded to brown. But enough remained to make her blood run cold. No choice in the matter. The debt must be honored, though it costs me everything I hold dear. I thought I could protect. The next section was destroyed by fire, hidden where even I cannot easily retrieve it. The compartment beneath the... more damage. Then, forgive me, but some bargains once made cannot be unmade. If they discover what I've done, the consequences will fall not just on me, but on... The rest was ash. Elara read it 3 times, each word settling into her chest like a stone. Her father's hand had been unsteady when he wrote this, the letters shaky in a way his writing never was. And the tone, desperate, frightened, guilty. The debt must be honored, hidden where even I cannot easily retrieve it. Some bargains, once made, cannot be unmade. She thought of the Duke's certainty that her father had been the last loyal Selwyn Guardian, faithful to an ancient covenant. She thought of the 300 years of honor the Duke was trying to restore, built on the assumption that the Selwyn line had remained true. What if they'd been wrong? What if James Selwyn hadn't been protecting the cipher at all, but had given it up? Sold it, perhaps, to pay some terrible debt, or hidden it so poorly that anyone with determination could find it. Hidden it badly on purpose, as payment for whatever bargain he'd struck. Elara's hands shook as she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She should take it to the Duke immediately. This was exactly the kind of evidence he'd been searching for. A direct reference to hiding something, to a compartment, to secrets her father had kept. But the words, "the consequences will fall," not just on me, kept echoing in her mind. If her father had betrayed the covenant, if he'd compromised the cipher somehow, the Duke's 300-year quest could end not in vindication, but in disaster. And Elara, the last Selwyn Guardian, would be revealed not as the solution, but as the daughter of the man who'd destroyed everything. She needed to understand what she'd found before she shared it. Needed to know what her father had done. The library was empty when she arrived, the Duke having ridden out to her father's former estate to oversee the beginning of the excavation. Dr. Ashford and Mr. Finch had accompanied him, leaving Elara alone with thousands of volumes and her growing dread. She went directly to the section containing the Selwyn family records, pulling down the volumes she'd studied before. This time, she read with different eyes, looking not for loyalty, but for cracks in the facade. She found the first hint in a letter dated 1798, from James Selwyn's father to a London solicitor. "I write to inquire about the legal ramifications of debts inherited through marriage. My son has recently wed, and I have discovered that his wife's family carries obligations I was not made aware of during negotiations." The wife referred to was Elara's mother, who had died when Elara was 6. She'd been the daughter of a minor baronet, well-bred but not wealthy. What debts could her family have carried? Elara kept searching. An hour later, she found a record of sale from 1802, the year after Elara's birth. James Selwyn had sold a significant portion of his library to a private collector in Bath. The sum was substantial, far more than the books themselves would have warranted. unless they contained something more valuable than the printed text. Hidden in plain sight, Elara thought. In books, in margins, like the note in the Bible. She pulled her father's Bible from the shelf where the Duke had left it, handling it with new suspicion. She'd assumed the marginal notes were simply family history, genealogical records, and personal reflections. But what if some of them were instructions? Coded messages about where to find what had been hidden. She turned to the psalm where Edmund Selwyn had written about green pastures. The Duke had interpreted it as a reference to the south pasture, and they were excavating it now. But what if it wasn't the only clue? What if her father had added his own notes, his own deceptions? She found it on the last page, tucked into the margin beside Revelation. The handwriting was definitely her father's, but the ink was fresh, written perhaps months before his death. The serpent devours its own tail. What was taken can never be returned. The Guardian failed. E.S. Forgive me. Elara's vision blurred. The serpent. The mark on Fennel's ear. The symbol of the Selwyn Guardian line. The Guardian failed. Her father hadn't been protecting the cipher. He'd lost it, or given it up, or destroyed it. And the Duke was about to excavate an empty pasture, chasing a treasure that no longer existed because James Selwyn had failed in his sacred duty. Miss Selwyn? She spun around, the Bible nearly slipping from her hands. Henderson stood in the doorway, his expression concerned. Are you quite well, miss? You look pale. I'm fine. The lie tasted like ash. Has His Grace returned? Not yet. The excavation is proving more extensive than anticipated. He sent word that he'll remain at the site until nightfall. Henderson paused. He also asked me to remind you that you're welcome to join him there, if you wish. He said you have as much right to witness the discovery as anyone. The discovery of nothing. The revelation that her father had been a failure, a betrayer, possibly a thief. Thank you, Henderson. I think I'll remain here. When the butler withdrew, Elara sank into the nearest chair, her father's Bible clutched against her chest. The half-burned letter in her pocket felt like a brand against her skin. She thought of the Duke's face when he spoke of his family's shame, of 300 years of searching, of his desperate need to restore honor to Marcus Roxbury's name. She thought of how he'd looked when he told her about being 8 years old and learning he came from traitor-made dukes. And she thought of how he would look when he discovered that the last Selwyn Guardian had betrayed everything. And she, Elara, had known and said nothing. She should tell him. Now, immediately. Send word to the excavation site, confess what she'd found, let him decide how to proceed. But the words her father had written kept her frozen. The consequences will fall not just on me. On who then? On her? On the Duke? On whatever bargain her father had struck that required giving up the one thing the Selwyn line had sworn to protect? Fennel appeared from wherever he'd been napping and pressed his warm body against her ankles. The little terrier looked up at her with absolute trust, his lopsided ear flopping forward, the serpent mark hidden beneath it. The mark that meant nothing if the Guardian line had failed. Elara closed her eyes and tried to decide whether protecting the Duke from disappointment was worth the betrayal of keeping secrets. Her father, it seemed, had faced the same choice. And his decision had led to burned letters and cryptic confessions and debts that could never be repaid. She prayed hers would not end the same way. The excavation of the south pasture yielded nothing but rocks, clay, and the rotted remains of an old sheep shelter. The Duke returned to Roxbury Hall 3 days later, looking hollowed out, his face drawn with exhaustion and something darker, the first real shadow of doubt Elara had seen in him. He said nothing about the failure, simply locked himself in the library and began cross-referencing the marginal notes in her father's Bible against estate maps and architectural records, searching for some alternative interpretation of green pastures that didn't involve the now thoroughly excavated field. Elara carried the half-burned letter in her pocket like a stone. Its weight growing heavier each day, she didn't confess what she'd found. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. But the truth was simpler and more cowardly. She was afraid of what the Duke would do when he learned her father had failed. Afraid of what he would think of her. The break came on the 7th day, not through ancient documents or scholarly research, but through Fennel's inexplicable obsession with the rose garden. Elara had taken him out for his afternoon walk, following the gravel paths through the formal gardens, while her mind churned with guilt and indecision. Fennel, usually content to explore wherever his nose led him, kept pulling insistently toward the rose garden, specifically toward the oldest section, where Victorian climbing roses sprawled across a crumbling stone wall. "Not there," Elara murmured, tugging gently on his lead. "Those roses have thorns like knives." Fennel whined and pulled harder, his small body straining against the leather. He'd never been this insistent before, never this single-minded about a destination. Elara let him lead. The old rose garden had clearly been magnificent once, but neglect had transformed it into something wild and overgrown. The roses climbed without restraint, their canes thick as a man's thumb, covered in thorns that caught at Elara's skirts as she pushed through. At the heart of the tangle, almost completely obscured by foliage, stood a stone plinth that might once have held a sundial or statue. Fennel went directly to it and began digging at the base with furious determination, his paws scrabbling at the earth and old leaves. "Fennel, stop. You'll hurt yourself." But the terrier was possessed by some instinct Elara didn't understand. He dug with increasing frenzy, whining and yipping, until Elara knelt beside him and began clearing away the debris with her own hands. Her fingers struck something solid beneath the leaves. Not stone, but wood. Old, rotted, but definitely carved. "Good boy," she whispered, her heart suddenly racing. "Good boy. What did you find?" She cleared away more earth, more decomposed leaves, until she could see it clearly. A small wooden box, no larger than a book, sealed with wax that had long since crumbled. The wood was carved with a pattern she recognized from the ancient manuscripts, intertwined serpents forming a border around a single letter, R. Roxbury. Elara sat back on her heels, her hands trembling. Fennel had found it. Not through documents or research or scholarly deduction, but through some inherited instinct, some knowledge passed down through his bloodline, just as the cipher had promised. The Guardian line had not failed. Her father had not betrayed the covenant. He had simply hidden it where only a guardian dog could find it. She should go get the Duke immediately. This was his quest, his family's honor, his 300-year search finally concluded. But she was already reaching for the box, already brushing away the last of the earth, already working her fingers beneath the lid. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Elara's blood went to ice. She turned to find a man standing at the edge of the rose garden, partially obscured by the climbing canes. He was perhaps 40, dressed in traveling clothes too fine for a casual visitor, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. And he was holding a pistol pointed directly at her chest. "Step away from the box, Miss Selwyn. Carefully, if you please." Elara stood slowly, positioning herself between the stranger and Fennel. "Who are you?" "My name is Thomas Carver. I'm an associate of Baroness Thorne's." though she doesn't know I'm here, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. The Baroness has many talents, but discretion in business matters isn't among them. He moved closer, the pistol never wavering. She told me about the Selwyn girl and her valuable little dog. Told me the Duke of Roxbury was searching for something worth a fortune. Naturally, I became curious. The Baroness doesn't know what's in the box. Neither do I. But if a duke is willing to invoke ancient charters and sequester young ladies in his estate to find it, I'm willing to wager it's worth stealing. Carver's smile was sharp as a blade. Now step aside. No. The single word surprised even Elara. But she didn't move, didn't step away from the box or from Fennel, who had begun to growl low in his throat. Carver's expression hardened. I don't want to shoot you, Miss Selwyn. Bad for business. Killing gentlewomen. But I will if you force me to it. This is your final warning. Elara! The Duke's voice cut through the garden like a whip. He appeared through the roses, moving with terrifying speed despite the thorns tearing at his coat. His eyes took in the scene instantly. Elara, the box, the armed stranger, and something deadly flashed across his face. Put down the weapon, the Duke said, his voice cold as winter frost. Now. Carver swung the pistol toward him. Stay where you are, Your Grace. I have no quarrel with you. I simply want what's in that box. That box belongs to my family. It was stolen 300 years ago, hidden by the Selwyn line, and protected by a covenant older than you can imagine. You have no right to it. Right is a peculiar concept when backed by a pistol. Carver gestured with the weapon. Miss Selwyn, bring me the box. His Grace can watch, but if he moves, I'll shoot him first and you second. Elara's mind raced. The box was small enough to throw, but Carver would likely shoot before she could manage it. She could release Fennel, let him run to safety, but the terrier was still growling protectively at her feet, utterly loyal and utterly vulnerable. The Duke's eyes met hers across the garden. In them, she saw something that made her breath catch. Not calculation or strategy, but raw, undisguised fear. Not for the cipher or his family's honor or 300 years of searching. For her. Miss Selwyn, the Duke said quietly. Do as he says. Give him the box. Your Grace. The box isn't worth your life. Nothing is worth your life. His voice cracked on the last word, the careful control splintering. Please, Elara. Just give it to him. It was the first time he'd used her Christian name. Carver's smile widened. How touching. The cold Duke of Roxbury has developed a conscience. Miss Selwyn, the box. Now. Elara bent slowly, her fingers closing around the small wooden container. It was heavier than she'd expected, dense with whatever 3 centuries of secrets it contained. She straightened, holding it against her chest. Bring it here. She took 1 step forward, then stopped. Because Fennel, still growling, had moved between her and Carver. The small terrier's body was rigid, his hackles raised, every line of him screaming challenge despite being a fraction of the man's size. The Guardian, protecting what he'd been bred for 300 years to protect. Call off your dog, Miss Selwyn. He won't hurt you. He's never bitten anyone in his life. Then he'll die learning. Carver aimed the pistol downward, toward Fennel's small body. Everything happened at once. Elara screamed and lunged forward, trying to scoop up Fennel. The Duke moved with shocking speed, crossing the distance between them in 3 strides. The pistol discharged with a crack that split the afternoon air. And someone, Elara couldn't see who, through the sudden tangle of bodies and thorns and roses, knocked the box from her hands, sending it flying into the overgrown garden. The pistol ball struck stone, sending chips of the old plinth scattering like shrapnel. Elara felt the Duke's arms close around her, his body becoming a shield between her and Carver's weapon as they tumbled together into the thorned roses. Pain lanced across her shoulders where the thorns caught. But the Duke took the worst of it, his back and arms shredding against the climbing canes as he twisted to protect her. Fennel yelped, scrambling free of the tangle, and disappeared into the undergrowth. "Fennel!" Elara struggled against the Duke's grip, but he held her fast. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice rough with something between fear and fury. Carver was already moving, crashing through the roses toward where the box had fallen. The Duke released Elara and lunged after him, his longer reach allowing him to catch Carver's coat. The two men grappled, stumbling through the thorned garden in a brutal dance. Elara pushed herself up, her hands bleeding from the thorns, her mind screaming one thought: Fennel. The terrier was small, easily lost in the overgrown garden, and if Carver still had the pistol, she heard barking, high-pitched and frantic, coming from deeper in the rose tangle. She followed the sound, pushing through canes that tore at her dress and skin, until she found him. Fennel stood over the wooden box, his small body planted protectively, still barking his challenge. The box had landed in a hollow at the base of the stone wall, partially hidden by fallen leaves. Behind her, she heard a crash and a grunt of pain. She turned to see the Duke and Carver locked together, fighting for control of the pistol. They slammed against the stone plinth, and the weapon discharged again, the shot going wild into the sky. The Duke's fist connected with Carver's jaw with a crack that made Elara flinch. The thief staggered backward, and the Duke wrenched the pistol from his grip, throwing it far into the roses. "Run!" the Duke shouted at Elara, not taking his eyes off Carver. "Take the dog and run back to the house." But Carver wasn't finished. He pulled a knife from his boot, the blade catching the afternoon sun, and launched himself at the Duke with desperate violence. Elara screamed. The Duke sidestepped, but not quickly enough. The knife sliced across his forearm, opening a line of crimson through the torn sleeve of his coat. He didn't make a sound, simply caught Carver's wrist and twisted with brutal efficiency. The knife fell. And then Henderson was there, appearing through the roses with 2 footmen, all of them armed with cudgels. They fell on Carver like a wave, subduing him with professional thoroughness. "Your Grace," Henderson said, breathing hard, his usual composure shattered. "We heard the shots." "See him bound and locked in the cellar," the Duke interrupted, his voice unnaturally calm despite the blood running down his arm. "Send for the magistrate. Charges of armed assault, attempted theft, and trespassing. I want him transported by week's end." The footman hauled Carver away, still struggling, still cursing. Henderson lingered, his eyes on the Duke's bleeding arm. "Your Grace, you're injured. I'm fine. Leave us." Henderson hesitated, then bowed and withdrew. The silence that followed was broken only by Fennel's continued barking and Elara's ragged breathing. The Duke stood perfectly still, his injured arm held against his chest, his face pale beneath the blood and dirt. Then he turned and looked at Elara, and something in his expression crumbled. "Are you hurt?" His voice was hoarse, shaking. "Did he touch you? Did the thorns—" "I'm fine. Your Grace. Your arm. Damn my arm." He crossed to her in 3 strides, his hands, one bloodied, one shaking, cupping her face with desperate gentleness. "You didn't run. I told you to run, and you didn't. I couldn't leave Fennel. To hell with Fennel. The words exploded from him, raw and anguished. To hell with the dog and the cipher and 300 years of searching. You could have been killed, Elara. That man had a loaded pistol pointed at you, and you stood there arguing about a damned box. His voice broke completely. He pulled her against his chest, one arm around her waist, the other hand cradling the back of her head, and she felt him shaking. I thought he was going to shoot you, the Duke whispered into her hair. I saw him aim, and I thought, I couldn't reach you in time. I thought... Elara's hands came up to grip his torn coat, her face pressed against his shoulder. He smelled of blood and roses and fear, and she felt the rapid hammer of his heart against her cheek. I'm safe, she whispered. I'm here. I'm safe. You're everything. The confession was muffled against her hair, barely audible. Somewhere between the library and the rose garden, between ancient covenants and morning walks with that ridiculous dog, you became everything. And I was too blind to see it until I thought I'd lost you. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hand still cradling her face. His eyes were no longer winter gray and cold. They were storm dark and blazing with something that stole Elara's breath. I don't care about the cipher, he said, each word deliberate, weighted with truth. I don't care if Marcus Roxbury was innocent or guilty. I don't care about 300 years of shame or my father's disappointment or what the peers in Parliament whisper behind my back. None of it matters. None of it has ever mattered as much as... He stopped, his jaw working as though the words were too large to speak. As much as what? Elara whispered. As much as you. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. As much as keeping you safe. As much as seeing you smile when Fennel does something absurd. As much as watching you decipher clues my entire team of scholars missed. As much as the way you look at me like I'm not just a duke or a title or a 300-year burden, but simply Edward. Her breath caught. He'd never asked her to use his Christian name. The cipher is over there, she said, her voice shaking. In the hollow by the wall, where Fennel found it. You could go get it right now. End your family's shame. Restore Marcus Roxbury's honor. Everything you've worked for. I don't want it. His forehead pressed against hers. Not if it means letting go of you. Not if it means going back to being the man I was before you arrived. Cold and obsessed and utterly alone. Edward, I'm choosing you, Elara. I'm choosing you over 300 years of history. I'm choosing you over my father's expectations and my family's legacy and everything I thought mattered. His voice dropped to a whisper. Please tell me I'm not choosing alone. Elara's answer was to rise on her toes and press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, tasting of blood and rose petals and desperate relief. Then the Duke's arms tightened around her, and the kiss deepened, became something urgent and claiming and absolutely certain. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fennel had stopped barking and was sitting beside the box, looking immensely pleased with himself. That dog, the Duke said, his voice rough with emotion, is the most intelligent creature I have ever met. Elara laughed, the sound breaking free like light through clouds. He found your cipher. He found you first. Edward tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. Everything else is secondary. We should still look, Elara said quietly. After 300 years, Marcus Roxbury deserves to have his story told. We'll look together. Edward took her hand, her torn, bloodied hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "But first, we're having Henderson tend these wounds. Then I'm writing to my solicitors to draw up a betrothal contract. And then, only then, will we open that box." "A betrothal contract?" Elara's heart stuttered. "Unless you have objections to marrying a traitor-made duke with an obsessive personality and a complete inability to throw sticks properly." She smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Only if you have objections to marrying the last Selwyn Guardian, who comes with no dowry, a terrible stepmother, and a scruffy terrier who digs holes in rose gardens." "None whatsoever." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a claim. "Though I insist Fennel gets his own suite of rooms. He's earned it." Henderson returned then, discreetly clearing his throat, followed by a maid carrying bandages and basin of water. The butler's eyes went immediately to the Duke's bleeding arm, then to the way he was holding Elara's hand, then to the wooden box by the wall where Fennel stood guard. "Your Grace," Henderson said carefully, "shall I retrieve the item?" Edward looked at Elara. She nodded. "Yes." "Carefully, Henderson. It's been waiting 300 years. It can wait until we've dealt with more pressing matters." "Of course, Your Grace." Henderson retrieved the box with reverent hands and set it on the stone plinth. "If I may say so, sir, your father would be proud." "My father," Edward said quietly, his hand tightening around Elara's, "wanted me to restore the family honor. I believe I finally have, just not in the way he expected." He turned to Elara, and she saw in his eyes not the driven, obsessed man who'd claimed her at the Pemberton ball, but someone entirely new. Someone who had chosen love over legacy, who had placed her safety above his life's singular purpose. Someone who was finally, truly free. They opened the box 3 hours later, in the library, after the physician had been summoned to tend Edward's arm and Elara's torn hands. The doctor, a practical man who asked no questions about how a duke and a young lady had both managed to look as though they'd fought a battle in a thorn bush, had cleaned, stitched, and bandaged with efficient professionalism before departing with a substantial fee and instructions to rest. Rest was impossible. The box sat on the library table between them, still sealed despite 3 centuries of burial. The wood was damaged, but intact. The carved serpent still visible beneath the dirt. Edward had cleaned it carefully with his unbandaged hand, while Elara watched, Fennel curled contentedly in her lap. "Before we open it," Edward said quietly, "I need you to understand something." Elara looked up from studying the intricate carving. "Whatever is inside, proof of innocence, confession of guilt, or nothing at all, it changes nothing between us. You're not here because of what your father protected or what this box might contain. You're here because I want you here, because I choose you here." The words settled around her like a benediction. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Open it," she said softly. 300 years is long enough to wait." Edward worked the seal carefully, his fingers steady despite what Elara knew this moment meant to him. The wax crumbled. The lid resisted, swollen with age and moisture, but finally yielded with a soft crack. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly preserved it from decay, was a single folded document. Edward lifted it with reverent hands, carefully unwrapping the protective cloth. The parchment was covered in dense script, the ink faded but still legible. At the top, in elaborate calligraphy, the true account of Marcus Roxbury, written in his own hand, September 1672. Edward's breath caught. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the document and began to read aloud. I, Marcus Roxbury, Duke of Roxbury, do set forth this account, knowing that I shall not live to speak it myself. The charges brought against me are false, manufactured by men who fear the reforms I propose to Parliament. I have been accused of corresponding with Catholic conspirators, but the letters presented as evidence are forgeries, created by Lord William Ashford to discredit my efforts to limit the power of the peerage over common freeholders. Edward's voice was steady, but Elara saw the emotion flickering across his face as he continued. I have compiled proof of Ashford's deception, copies of his actual correspondence, witness statements from the forger he employed, financial records showing payments made for my destruction. This evidence I entrust to my dearest friend, Sir Edmund Selwyn, who has sworn to guard it until such time as a Roxbury with courage enough to challenge the established order emerges. Let this cipher prove not just my innocence, but the corruption that condemned me. The document continued with specifics, names, dates, details of the conspiracy that had destroyed Marcus Roxbury. At the bottom, his signature, bold and defiant even in the face of death. And beneath it, in different ink, a note from Edmund Selwyn. I have kept faith with Marcus Roxbury. I have preserved this truth, though it cost me title and fortune. May a future Roxbury prove worthy of his ancestor's sacrifice. And may the Selwyn line remain faithful guardians until that day arrives. E.S. 1674. Edward set the document down carefully, his hand still trembling. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply stared at the proof his family had sought for 3 centuries. He was innocent, he finally whispered. Marcus was innocent, and Edmund Selwyn preserved the proof despite losing everything. Your family's honor is restored, Elara said softly. No. Edward looked up at her, his eyes bright. Marcus's honor is restored. My family? He paused, choosing his words carefully. My family built wealth and power on the foundation of his death. We took the title, the estates, the privileges that should have gone to his children. We lived in luxury for 300 years while his name rotted, and the Selwyn line that defended him was reduced to poverty. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The cipher doesn't absolve the Roxbury line, Elara. It condemns us. We should have fought harder, searched longer, risked more to clear his name. Instead, we accepted the benefits of his execution and called ourselves cursed. Elara set Fennel down and crossed to him, placing her bandaged hand on his arm. Edmund Selwyn didn't preserve this out of bitterness. He preserved it out of love and loyalty, the same qualities you've shown in your search. The same qualities that made you choose to protect me, rather than secure the cipher when Carver attacked. Edward turned to her, his expression raw. I spent my entire life believing honor was about restoring the past, but you've taught me it's about choosing rightly in the present. He took both her hands in his, careful of her injuries. Marcus Roxbury was wrongly condemned, but the greater wrong would be for me to honor his memory while treating you as merely a means to an end. You've never... I brought you here because of a dog, Edward interrupted, his voice thick with self-recrimination. I claimed you under an ancient covenant, trapped you in this house, made you feel like a prisoner. I was so obsessed with vindicating a man 300 years dead that I nearly sacrificed the living woman in front of me. But you didn't. Elara squeezed his hands. When it mattered, when the choice was between the cipher and my safety, you chose me. That's the honor Marcus Roxbury would have recognized. Not the restoration of his name, but the willingness to put people before pride. Edward's eyes searched hers. I don't deserve you, Probably not, she said with a small smile. But I'm choosing you anyway. A traitor-made duke who throws sticks badly and reads ancient documents for entertainment and sees me as more than just the last Selwyn Guardian. You're Elara. He said her name like a prayer. You're brilliant and brave, and you deciphered in days what my scholars couldn't manage in years. You're the woman who stood between an armed man and a scruffy terrier without hesitation. He paused, then dropped to one knee with formal deliberation. You're the woman I'm asking to be my duchess, my partner, my equal in all things. Not because of any covenant or guardian line or 300-year quest, but because I love you. The words hung in the library air, simple and devastating and absolutely true. Elara Selwyn, will you marry me? She pulled him to his feet and kissed him, her answer clear in the way she melted against him, the way her hands tangled in his hair, the way she whispered yes against his lips between kisses. Fennel barked his approval, tail wagging furiously. The betrothal was announced 3 days later, with all the formality befitting a duke's engagement. But before the announcement, before the flood of congratulations and society gossip and inevitable speculation, Elara insisted on one final task. She returned to the Baroness's London house, accompanied by Edward and Henderson and 2 footmen, to collect the few remaining items that belonged to her. Araminta received them in her drawing room, her face a mask of cold fury barely concealed beneath social propriety. "Miss Selwyn," the Baroness said, not rising from her settee, "how kind of you to finally remember your family." "You're not my family," Elara said quietly. Her voice was steady, strengthened by the knowledge that Edward stood beside her, that she was no longer powerless. "You never were?" Araminta's eyes flickered to the Duke. "I see His Grace has been efficient in securing whatever treasure he sought. I assume you helped him find it?" "We found something far more valuable than treasure," Edward said, his voice carrying the weight of ducal authority. "We found truth, and each other." "How touching." The Baroness's smile was sharp. "I hope you realize, Your Grace, that marrying my stepdaughter means inheriting her father's debts. James Selwyn died owing considerable sums." "James Selwyn died owing nothing," Elara interrupted. She pulled the half-burned letter from her reticule and held it up. "I found this hidden in my trunk. I've spent days trying to understand what debt he referred to, what bargain he'd made, and then I realized the debt was to you, Baroness. You discovered he was protecting something valuable, and you blackmailed him. Demanded money to keep your silence about the Selwyn Guardian line." Araminta's face went very still. "My father didn't fail in his duty," Elara continued, her voice growing stronger. "He protected the cipher despite your attempts to extort him. He died rather than reveal its location. And now that protection has passed to me. But I'm not the powerless girl you humiliated at the Pemberton ball." "You're nothing but—" "She's my future duchess," Edward said coldly. "And if you complete that sentence, Baroness, I will ensure that every door in London society closes to you. Permanently." The Baroness stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "You think a title protects you? You think marriage to a traitor-made duke gives you power?" "No," Elara said softly. "I think choosing love over legacy, people over pride, and truth over 300 years of shame gives me power. I came here to tell you that I'm not afraid anymore. You can't hurt me. You can't control me. And you'll never touch my family again." She turned to Edward, taking his offered arm. "I believe we're finished here, Your Grace." They left the Baroness standing in her drawing room, her face mottled with fury, her final weapon, fear, rendered completely useless. Outside, in Edward's carriage with Fennel curled between them, Elara finally allowed herself to breathe freely. "That was magnificently done," Edward murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I learned from the best." She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the certainty of his protection. "A very severe duke who taught me that some battles are worth fighting. And a very brave woman taught me that some treasures have nothing to do with ancient parchments." He pulled her closer. "Are you ready to face society as my betrothed?" "I'm ready to face anything," Elara said, "as long as I have you and Fennel." The terrier's tail thumped agreement. They returned to Roxbury Hall as the sun set, bathing the gray stone in golden light. It no longer looked like a fortress to Elara, but like home, a place where ancient honor had been restored, where love had triumphed over obsession, and where a scruffy guardian dog would live in pampered luxury for the rest of his days. The cipher would be presented to Parliament the following month. Marcus Roxbury's name formally cleared, his descendants finally vindicated. But the true legacy, Elara knew, wasn't written on 300-year-old parchment. It was written in the way Edward looked at her, in the home they would build together, in the choice to value people over pride, love over legacy, in the faithful guardian who had led them both out of isolation and into light. My lovely family, you stayed until the end of Elara and Edward's story. You're my people. You're the ones who believe in second chances, in love that heals, in courage that transforms. But I need to be honest with you. I poured days into researching Regency customs, crafting every scene, voicing every emotion so you could escape into this world for free. The only thing I ask in return is this. If this story moved you, if you smiled when Fennel found the cipher, if you felt your heart race when Edward chose Elara over his life's obsession, don't let this be the last story you hear. Subscribe so you never miss the next tale. Share this with someone who needs to remember that they're worthy of being chosen. And comment below telling me, what would you have done if you found that burned letter? Your words fuel my creativity. Thank you for being here. Until our next story, remember, you deserve a love that chooses you first. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team,